the previous lectures were theoretical approaches to the origins and nature of the state, and then the origins of the nation, feuds and war. And then the last one I looked at the dispute settlements, and these are all coming now down together in looking at forms of violence and the relations between the state and the citizen. It's diagrammatically represented here. I dealt with wars, which is the outer level of the relations between states and nations. Feuds, which are half internal, between groups which recognise a great deal of commonality and yet are quarrelling with each other, as in Israel and Palestine and so on. And then I'm going to go on filling in the inner groups. So let's start with bandits. So, do any of you know what the derivation of the word bandit is from? Where the word came from and what it means? Any guesses? Banditi, Italia. Any of you Italian speakers? Someone is pointing to someone else, but anyway, it means outside the law. And it came from the Italian word for outside the law. An Italian word, this is the Oxford English Dictionary, used of foreign countries in the 16th and 17th centuries. Literally a proscribed, outlawed person, particularly associated with mountain districts of Italy, Sicily, Spain, Greece, and Turkey. None of them around here, you'll be glad to hear. So, why do you have bandits? And why particularly in that area? Well, there's a strange old book in the Haddon Library by someone called Roger Pino, his name is up there, called Brigands and Bandits, and he addressed himself to the question of why there were so many bandits in Italy. And he said it was historical and political. After the fall of Rome, Italy was divided into many small kingdoms, and one of the things you need for bandits is a place to escape to. If you're outside the law, people will be chasing you. If you can go across the border, then you may be protected by people in the other place. So bandits tend to be on borders and edges, hence the Scottish borders. There were roving semi-bandits between Scotland and England traditionally, North and Southern Ireland. Anywhere you have a border where people can flee across. Secondly, he thought it was geographical. It's difficult to be a bandit because the state will pursue you, and if you have some natural cover, either a forest, a water margin, a marsh, as in the famous Chinese novel The Water Margin, and Hero with the Wake in this area, or mountains which you can escape into, then you can continue. He has a rather whimsical idea that it's also a rather nice climate for outdoor life, and these bandits lived an al fresco existence, drinking Italian wine and picnicking in the forest. But I think the more serious point is that the state finds it difficult to track down bandits in a mountainous country. And finally, he thought it was to do with the attitudes towards the state and law. He thought, there's a half-truth in it, that the Latin, Greek and Celtic peoples instinctively question the equity, the fairness of laws, and question those in authority, while Scandinavian, Teutonic, Northern European people have a rather more positive attitude. It wasn't a racial thing, it was a historical thing, and there's a sort of half-truth in that if you had lived in a fairly benign state, as the English have for long periods, and the Dutch and so on, you tend to trust people go up and ask the policeman at the time, and in some societies you wouldn't do that. So there is a different attitude towards the law in these the Mediterranean regions and in the north. There are half-truths in all those things, and it's been supplemented by two further sets of theories. One was, I didn't write it up, but some anthropologists called the Schneiders, Schneiders, worked in Western Sicily, and they put forward the theory that where you have a very valuable commodity which is very portable in Western Sicily, it was animal rustling. But it could be narcotics, as in Colombia or the Golden Triangle, where you have something that can be easily shipped and moved around. There you will have people who will specialize in this, and bandits often draw their income from being involved in this illegal kind of trading. But perhaps the most famous book on bandits is by Eric Hobsbawm, a little paperback which has caused a great stir in the 1970s, the great Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm, in which he defined the bandit as a form of individual or minority rebellion within peasant societies. It's the time of Che Guevara and the 1970s and rebellion against oppressive states. And he wrote a book which was a sort of thinly disguised justification for that kind of activity. And he took as his archetype Robin Hood, who didn't steal, as you know, from his neighbours, but attacked the rich and gave to the poor. And he found a uniform form of social banditry, as he called it, from China, Peru, Sicily, the Ukraine, or Indonesia, and throughout the Americas and Europe. It was, he said, located at particular times in periods of political and economic dislocation. For example, the worst time for banditry in Central Europe was in the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, or in the 1920s in China, when China was full of warlords. While endemic, while present in all peasantries, he says it becomes epidemic when peasants begin to turn into capitalists. A shift from in modes of production is a time of great insecurity and division, and this is the time when banditry is often rife. It's related to the weak integration of the state, so that the peasant community is largely autonomous, and the state is unable to police it, and when it does, it has to do it with great brutality, and hence the scepticism about the police forces. And, as before, it's geographically on the margin, in the fens, forests, mountains. And he adds another twist, which is that it tends to take place in pastoral areas, areas where people customarily herd animals, because this requires very little manpower. One boy can herd a flock of sheep or whatever, and as a result there's high levels of unemployment in these areas. And there are usually two solutions to this. If you think about Switzerland, if you think about the Himalayas, if you think about my ancestors, the Scots, what do you do with your surplus sons? And what you do is either send them off into the empire, off into the army, the Swiss Guards, the Scots regiments, and the Gurkhas, that's Gurkhas, from the area I work in Nepal, in central Nepal. Send them off to foreign armies, but if there are no foreign armies for them to go to, they form their own army of bandits who predate on the settled people down in the valleys. The major criticism of Hobsbawm's work, is quite a simple criticism, is that by narrowing banditry down to social banditry, to the good form, so to speak, the Robin Hood form, he overlooks the fact that bandits are very often and usually actually just as predatory as anyone else. They are a form of gangsterism, as Barrington Moore, whose name I've written up there, writes about China. The use of violence to prey on the population indiscriminately without the slightest interest in altering the political system, because in a sense Hobsbawm was trying to argue that it's a form of peasant revolution against the state. And Barrington Moore points out that most bandits, including the Chinese warlords, had no intention of changing the state. They were predatory. And he says it's necessary to beware of romanticising the robber as a friend of the poor just as much as of accepting the official image. Characteristically, local inhabitants would bargain with the bandits in order to be left in peace. Quite often, local gentry leaders were on cordial terms with bandits. And the same sort of criticism is made by Anton Bloch in his famous book on the Sicilian Mafia. He says, I argued the element of class conflict, which was another part of Hobsbawm's thesis, that it's a working class, or at least a peasant revolt, as embodied in certain forms of banditry, has received undue emphasis. Rather than actual champions of the poor and the weak, bandits quite often terrorise those from whose very ranks they manage to rise, and thus help to suppress them. We know that bandits have fulfilled political roles in the demobilization of peasants. So by its over narrow definition of social banditry and a little consideration of the wider political setting, it's given a rather distorted picture. The last point I want to make really is that, as with most social sciences, the theories that we have provide perhaps some necessary but not sufficient, that is, they may be the background, but they in themselves don't always explain the outcome, necessary but not sufficient causation. Because if you look at the theory very simply, where would you find bandits? Mountains, ravines, marshes. Where? On political boundaries. Where? In pastoral societies. When? In this stage between peasant level one turning into capitalist and so on. Times of political and economic dislocation. When the central government is weak. Well, if you actually apply those necessary current conditions to 3 cases which I've looked at, you find that they have all these conditions, but they don't have bandits. Upland Nepal, where I worked, in the last 100 years has all these things. It's a border with Tibet and so on and so on and so on. But I didn't encounter any bandits, and there are no legends or stories of bandits in the area I worked in, the Annapurna Mountains. It's a Buddhist area, and the people were recruited into the British Army, and there may be reasons for that, but it isn't a sufficient condition. A second is southwestern China. Certainly since the Mao era, and to a certain extent before, it was quite politically integrated. Likewise in Japan, Japanese history, there were the 47 Ronin, and there have been violent gangs in Japanese history, but you can't really talk about banditry in a serious way in Japan. And finally, in England, I did a study of a group of highwaymen and coin clippers and robbers on the border between England and Scotland in Cumbria. I wrote a book about this, and they didn't behave at all like bandits. They stole from when they wanted to, and they weren't looked up to. They were just highwaymen and robbers. Moving on to the next layer, mafia. Okay, so are any of you members of the mafia, before I do them down? Yeah, we have one member here, which by putting her hand up, she's declared that she isn't a member, because no member of the mafia would ever declare themselves. It's a secret organisation. I think Woody Allen had a joke about how when he raided what was supposed to be a mafia headquarters in Chicago, they didn't find any headed notepaper and no stationery. There is no stationery, it's a secret organisation, and you don't put your hand up in class, so you've been found out. And those of you who are really mafia will be taking notes carefully. Do any of you know what mafia means, or comes from, the etymology? Any suggestions? Well, sorry. I'm deaf. What? Family. That's more Cosa Nostra. Mafia, no one quite sure, but the nearest sort of ideas. One is that it comes from the Arabic, meaning place of refuge. This is from Gambetta, who's written one of the standard books on the mafia, and the other is that it may mean the rejected. It stands for a morality based on revenge, blood for blood, stress on silence, vengeance after a delay, manliness, and machismo, omerta, O-M-E-R-T-A, honour, manliness, standing up for your rights. And according to Norman Lewis, who wrote one of the best books on it, it was the product of weak government that had developed its own vested interest in governmental weakness. So let's have a look at it a little bit more carefully. The best single book on it is Anton Bloch's The Mafia of the Sicilian Village, and he describes a situation there which is rather unimaginable for me. I live in a Fenland village of 800 people, and as far as I know, in the last century, there were no murders. There might have been one murder or in it, but no really. Whereas he says the recourse to violence prevalent in this part of Sicily and expressed in theft, extortion, ransom, arson, shooting and homicide was taken for granted and accepted rather than questioned. Every gesture, every organisation, every activity was saturated by violence. Even everyday language reflects the part played by unlicensed violence in Sicilian peasant society. I don't bring many visual display things in, but a lot of mafia violence, it would have been more plausible if the lady at the front who had offered to be a mafia person had been wearing a rather threatening hat. If you can't see my eyes, there's a chance I might be a mafia. The mafia wear dark glasses, most of their jackets up. They wear their brims low. If I'm like this, I'm clearly not a mafia. It's that symbolic. They work with symbols. If someone is killed, for example, and you find a prickly pear left casually beside the dead body, you know it's a mafia. They deal in threats and menaces and indirect. They make you offers you can't refuse. I must tell you the joke about postmodernism. A postmodernist is a person who makes you an offer you can't understand. Anyway, mafia is someone who makes you an offer you can't refuse, and they do it by symbolic threatening. And they kill people also. For example, the village of Guanado, I've written the name, with a population of 2,000, from 1916 to 1966, that's in 50 years, between 1916 and 1966, had no less than 93 homicides. It's 2 a year in a population of 2,000 people. Imagine living in a world like that, and that's just the top of the iceberg of ransom, extortion and threat. So why mafia? Anton Bloch puts forward a political interpretation. He basically sees the mafia as brokers of violence. The state formation, which was rather weak and constantly threatened, Sicily went through many stages of foreign rule and dislocation, and so its state system was very weak, and it was just developing into a modern nation state. And his argument is that it's the transition from a pre-nation state society to an ineffective modern nation state, the situation you now get in Afghanistan or Iraq, that breeds this kind of violence in the 19th and 20th century. The mafia acted as brokers, as middlemen, tolerated by the law and landlords as informal agents of order in this in-between situation. They inhabit the interstices. The interstices are the gaps between things, between bricks, for example, between landlord and peasant, between the city and the country, the great and the little traditions. They grow and decline in relation to central power. If the central power is very powerful, then the interstices are very suppressed and the mafia disappear. But if there's a lot of weakness in that relationship, the mafia pivot, as in the fall of the Soviet Union. So that the weakness of the state throughout most of the last 150 years, combined with the great poverty, physical hardship caused by the climate, disease and terrain, and the social atomism of a particular kind of kinship system that they have in southern Italy, a cognatic, that is, you trace your descent through both sides, and therefore there are no strong kinship groups. The reference to Cosa Nostra, the family-like ideology of the mafia, it is you are brothers in the mafia, and it creates a fictive kinship sentiments. You have a feeling of we, the subgroup of the mafia, and this is necessary in a situation where neither the state nor the family is providing integration, and one where informal violence has flourished. So it's mainly a political response to weakness of the state, and of course it is a negative feedback because it makes the state weak by its presence. The second major interpretation is by Diego Gambetta, later at this university, and his central thesis was that the mafia is a specific economic enterprise an industry which produces, promotes and sells private protection. It's a sort of glorified mixture of Securitor and an insurance company. The mafia creates a need for itself by destroying trust and then supplying it, as do most bureaucracies, not a feature of bureaucratic organisations. They create a need for themselves, and the mafia does it in relation to physical fear and insecurity. It deals in the same commodity as the state, i.e. the security of the individual and their businesses. It deals particularly in those areas where the state cannot intervene. Every time the state decrees a particular transaction or commodity illegal, a potential market for private protection is created. So drugs and prostitution and anything that the state decides is illegal, immediately a mafia-like organisation will step in because it can control and police this and make money from it. I think the whole of the Gambetta thesis is put together, is encapsulated in one image which always stays with me, in the following words. When the butcher comes to me to buy an animal, he knows that I want to cheat him. But I know that he wants to cheat me. You don't trust the butcher. Thus we need, say, Pepe, that is a third party, a member of the mafia, to make us agree. And we both pay Pepe a percentage of the deal. In other words, you have the mafia person standing there beside you when you make your deal. If either of you reneges on it, they're in trouble with the mafia. So the mafia insures contracts, as the state should do, but is unable to do. He says, my claim is that the making of the market for mafia services is to be found in unstable transactions in which trust is scarce and fragile. So, rather than, as Bloch had put it, they are violent entrepreneurs, they are, in Gambetta's words, entrepreneurs of violence. Their commodity is violence. If you've got a shop, someone will come into it and say, you know, you've got a lot of glass in this window, aren't you a bit frightened that someone will come and smash it? And you say, well, it had been worrying me. He said, well, you know, I'm sure no one will, if you want. If you could just give me a pile of those nice chocolates over there, whatever it is, and he gives over the chocolates and no one smashes the window. The word is put out not to smash that window. But if he doesn't, the window is smashed. Next time he knows. Those who step out of line will suffer, and you know who these people are by these symbolic ways they walk, they dress, the words they use. So those are two characterizations of something which is now pretty widespread in the world. You find different forms of it, obviously, in India. I once asked an Indian sociologist how many people in India were involved in mafia-type organizations, and I expected him to say something like tens of thousands or a million or two, and he said, he thought for a bit, and he said something like 100 million, which is about 1 in 10 of the Indian population. What he meant were the families and their associates and so on. But it's very, very widespread, as you know, and also in another form in Russia. And therefore it's worth trying to understand its structure, and those two theories give us a hold on it. The last theory I'll mention, which is interesting, is by someone called Arlacchi, and he worked in Calabria, the toe of Italy, and he did a fascinating study which showed that mafia, even in a small area of Calabria, either exist or don't exist because of the social structure and the economic formation. In Cosentino, where you have minifundia, that is very small peasants working their own holdings, there's no mafia. I've written up the names of these places. In Crotonese, there are large, this is latifundia, the very large estates with paid workers on them. There's no mafia. It's in the plain of Gioia, in between, where you have unstable, medium-sized agricultural holdings. Yet
a fully working market economy has not emerged. There's a war of all against all, as he says, families against families, groups against groups. There's no civil society, there's no proper government. There the mafia flourish. The mafiosi become the civil and criminal judges, mediators, protectors, arbitrators, subsuming to themselves many delicate functions normally exercised by the powers of the state. And then finally there's the Yakuza. I've written out their name. This is the Japanese equivalent, who are totally bizarre. They are permitted by the state. They don't hide themselves. If I'd said to any of you, are you Yakuza? You might well have said, yes, I am. For instance, in board meetings, they come and sit along the back of board meetings with their dark glasses, their chopped off fingers and their tattoos slightly visible. And the board, people who are going to question the board at open meetings keep quiet, because they know if they don't, as they go out, they'll be hustled and threats will be made. I remember the shock of walking late at night through a Japanese city and taking my camera towards what looked like a taxi office, people behind the counter, and my Japanese friends stopped me very quickly and said, don't do that, that's a Yakuza recruiting office. So they stage public strikes against unfair behaviour towards the Yakuza, and so on and so on. They're very open, and they control those illegal areas which the state can't go into: prostitution, gambling, illegal entertainments. All that world is controlled by the Yakuza. All the police know exactly who they are, they have them on their computers. And so they help the state to keep away from trying to police dangerous crime, which nearly always corrupts police forces. So they're a very interesting phenomenon. We're moving now into an area where the state feels threatened from within. The mafia and the bandits are at least delimited slightly off. The mafia is a bit of a threat because they permeate inwards. But heretics, the very nature of heretics and terrorists is you can't tell them. If I asked how many people are heretics, you might not know, but in any case, you probably wouldn't reveal it, and you certainly probably wouldn't reveal that you were terrorists. So this is the enemy within. And historically, in the last 20 years, we've moved curiously back to a situation, and this is all I can really tell you now, to a feeling of moral panic and threat from the enemy within, which has characterized European history again and again in the past. But it sort of evaporated in the 20th century and the 19th century, to a large extent, though I'll give you exceptions. But it was very prevalent in earlier periods, and it's suddenly come back with a vengeance. The basic idea is that there is a force of evil, an evil power which is out there trying to get us. If you have any sense of paranoia, you will happily subscribe to this. Those in power, and the government particularly, feel this threat. And through, if you look at the history of the last 500 years, it's been targeted on different groups. It started off with the medieval Jews, who were rumoured to form an international conspiracy to undermine Christian values, and as a result, they ate babies and they poisoned wells and they did horrible rituals against Christianity, and they were caught and they were burnt and they were executed. Alongside other medieval heretics, the Albigensians and the others in southern France. Then in the 15th century, a new threat emerged, the threat of the devil and his covens, the witches, Satan or the devil, and I wrote my original PhD on English witchcraft. These witches were thought to be subverting. They danced upside down, flew through the air, ate children, did all the things that medieval Jews had done, but added some refinements to it. And what they did in answer to this was to change the whole legal system, to introduce new forms of torture and interrogation, and to weaken the defences people could put up against this, even in England, and especially in Germany and France. And the result was that a whole witch hunting period developed between about 1450 and 1700, in which tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people in Scotland, Germany, Italy, Spain, and to a lesser extent in England, particularly this area, East Anglia, were brought before the courts, convicted of these horrible offences against their religion, and in this country executed and elsewhere burnt either alive or not alive. After about 200 years of this, a number of people, all the time there have been people who say, I'm not sure there really are witches. Towards the end, more and more people said, I don't believe in it, and I think it's the methods to deal with them which is creating the phenomenon. And that view began to prevail after the 1650s and 60s, not just really because of the scientific revolution, but for all sorts of complicated reasons. And so by about 1750, most people said, good heavens, we killed and maimed and tortured and tried hundreds of thousands of people for an offence which we don't believe exists. It's very easy to do. It's an object lesson about how the machinery of justice creates its objects. For a while, it looked as if this kind of activity had faded away. But again in the 20th century, other similar kinds of threat were dealt with in a similar way. The first famous McCarthy trials in America in the 1950s, Senator McCarthy's un-American activities trials, were very similar. They were known as witch hunts. He basically used the same techniques, which is he would get one person in and then force them to tell on other people and then bring them in, and he would lie to people and he would deceive people and he created fear and so on. And many people's lives were ruined and people committed suicide and so on for about 3 or 4 years. And then one or two brave people and newspaper people just stood up to him and said, you're lying and it's not true. And earlier on they would have been thrown into prison for this, but the tide turned against him. He was exposed and the whole thing was shown to be 99% a figment of his and the method's imagination. The same thing happened again about 15 years ago with the satanic child abuse trials in northern English towns, Bolton, in Newcastle, in the Orkneys and Hebrides. There's a very good book by the anthropologist Jean Lafontaine called Talk of the Devil, which she was on the government commission to investigate this, and I gave her some advice about how the witches had been, and the whole witchcraft thing had been exposed, and she applied this to the satanic child abuse. And it all turned out that people had been thrown into prison, their children had been taken away for up to 15, 20 years on the basis of complete gobbledygook, complete rubbish, complete leading questions, a frame of mind very similar both to McCarthy and the Inquisition. And it was all a complete hoax and rubbish. Extraordinary. And this is 15, 20 years ago. And false memory syndrome and so on continue. These things will continue and you will face them during your life. So be extremely sceptical. And the last instance of it is the axis of evil. Now this is different in the sense that there are people who want to use bombs and blow up the world and the rest of it. But it's based on the same premise. There is a secret world of evil trying to get us, led by Bin Laden or whatever. And they are in our midst, and they are a constant threat, and we have to change the legal system in order to battle with them, and so on. And so the methods that are being used in Guantanamo Bay and so on are exactly the same methods that were used in the Portuguese Inquisition. Now, there was an article by John Simpson yesterday, they're now force-feeding people in Guantanamo, and it's widely known in America that very, very few of them are linked in any way to any terrorist organisation, and yet they're incarcerated. They're using the same networking techniques that they use in Argentina to try and pick up convicts. Late Charles Clark of King's College is implicated in this. And although it's more difficult, as I say, because there is an element of terrorism, it's not like witchcraft or satanic child abuse, 99.9% rubbish. In fact, in the case of witches, totally rubbish. There is an element of danger in it, and so you do have to take some precautions, but it's got out of all precaution. And the result is, of course, that we are now in what Bush has now stopped calling a war on terrorism, but a long war.
And the effects of this on civil liberties are obvious. If you are in a long war, you gradually strip away all the civil liberties, and you leave your citizens defenceless in the face of your government. And this takes me to my last point, which is on civil society. Many of you may have wondered what civil society, which is a word you may have come across, means. To me, it means all those institutions which lie between the state and the citizen. It means colleges, clubs, churches, sects, universities, business organisations. It means the plethora of middle-level organisations where we unite together to do something, and we're not beholden to the state. It's an extraordinary achievement, and it was the heart of American development and a long tradition in Britain. States don't like civil society. Fascism means to gather up into a bundle, and what the fascists did was to gather up these groups into the state, abolish them all. Any alternative to the state has to be abolished as a threat to the state. Communism did the same thing. China, to a large extent, has to try and do the same thing. It's threatened by any alternative to its own state system. But it is our one protection, because it means that we have a buffer around us, just like the jury that I was explaining to you before. And so the defence of civil society, in that way, our rights to congregate, freedom of speech within these limits, and so on, is terribly important. Cambridge is alive with it, all the societies and groups and so on that you join. But it's something that we should preserve. But it is directly threatened by an endless war against an evil foe. So be very, very careful when you are fed this claptrap.